Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a really deep plunge into Ukraine. It's a nation, strategically perched right at the crossroads of Europe and Russia. And now, tragically, it's the heart of the bloodiest conflict Europe has seen since World War II. So our mission here is to comb through our sources. We've got articles, research, our own notes, and really pull out those crucial nuggets of knowledge, those key insights. Think of it as maybe your shortcut to really getting a handle on what's at stake. We'll try to pack in some surprising facts, maybe even a little humor where appropriate, just to keep you hooked.
Yeah, and it's vital to grasp, I think, that Ukraine's historical role, well, it's often been overlooked, hasn't it? But now it's undeniably central to this renewed great power rivalry. I mean, many analysts really believe this geopolitical tension is going to shape international relations for decades.
Absolutely. And the 2022 invasion, it wasn't just a new conflict starting from scratch. It was this dramatic, really historic escalation of an 8-year struggle. A struggle that, truly kicked off with Russia's annexation of Crimea back in 2014. It's fundamentally reshaped European security. So, let's start to unpack this complex story. Okay, maybe let's start by looking back a bit through a historical lens. Ukraine's significance within the Soviet Union, for instance. It wasn't just another republic. It was, foundational. A cornerstone, really. Second only to Russia in population and power among all 15 Soviet republics. Just imagine, the USSR relied heavily on Ukraine for so much. Huge agricultural output, key defense industries, a big chunk of its military.
Including the Black Sea Fleet, which is critical.
Exactly, and even part of its nuclear arsenal. Its importance was just immense.
And what's really striking here, I think, is that Ukraine's decision, its move to declare independence in 1991, that wasn't just about Ukraine itself. It arguably proved to be the coup de grace, that final decisive blow for the whole ailing Soviet superpower.
Right. Which brings up a really important question, doesn't it? Why? Why did this specific region hold such pivotal importance? Enough to be the final straw for the USSR.
That's the core of it, really.
And then you move into its 3 decades of independence, and this is where it gets really fascinating. Ukraine's constantly been walking this tightrope, trying to balance foreign relations while navigating these incredibly deep internal divisions. You basically see this split, right? On one side, a more nationalist Ukrainian-speaking population, mostly in the West, generally pushing for closer ties with Europe, integration. And on the other, a largely Russian-speaking community, mainly in the East, historically favoring stronger links with Russia. This inherent tension, well, it really sets the stage.
And that internal dynamic sadly became a literal battleground in 2014. That's when Russia annexed Crimea, a move that just shocked the international system. I mean, the first time since World War II, a European state just absorbed territory from another like that.
Unbelievable, really.
And beyond Crimea, you had Russia playing a major role, arming and abetting separatists in the Donbass region. The fighting there was just brutal. Over 14,000 people died between 2014 and 2021. It was the bloodiest conflict in Europe since the Balkan Wars in the 90s.
So connecting that history back to the bigger picture, the global security environment, it's clear these hostilities weren't just isolated incidents. They really signaled a major shift, didn't they? Away from that largely unipolar period, U.S. dominance, towards an era now defined by this renewed, intense competition between major powers.
A whole new ballgame.
Okay, so to really get to the heart of this conflict, we needed to dig into Russia's interests in Ukraine. And these are profound. They're multifaceted. It's not just politics or economics. It's deeply cultural, almost central to Russia's own identity, its vision of itself. You start with the family ties, as people often call them. Kyiv, Ukraine's capital. It holds this almost sacred place in Russian history, the mother of Russian cities.
Right, the cradle of Kievan Rus's.
Exactly. That early Slavic state where modern Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, they all trace their lineage back. It's where Christianity came to the Slavic peoples, anchoring this shared, deep historical and spiritual space.
And building on those deep roots, you had, back in the 2001 census, around 8 million ethnic Russians living in Ukraine, mostly concentrated in the south and east. And Moscow, of course, often cited this supposed duty to protect these populations. That became the narrative, the pretext, really, for its actions in Crimea and Donbass in 2014.
And beyond those ties, there's also this powerful superpower image motivation for Moscow, isn't there? A lot of Russian politicians genuinely seem to view the separation from Ukraine after the Soviet collapse as a huge historical mistake. A direct hit to Russia's standing.
Yeah, a blow to prestige.
The very idea of Ukraine firmly aligning with the West, that was seen as a major affront. And then in 2022, you hear President Putin himself framing the war as this broader, almost existential struggle against Western powers, supposedly trying to dismantle Russia.
And Crimea itself offers a particularly telling example of this dynamic. You remember Khrushchev transferred it from Russia to Ukraine back in 1954, ostensibly to foster brotherly ties.
Right, a symbolic gesture at the time.
But after the Soviet Union fell apart, many Russian nationalists, both in Russia and actually in Crimea too, they really longed for its return and its strategic importance. Well, you just can't overstate it. Sevastopol is the historic, vital home port for Russia's Black Sea Fleet. It dominates the whole region, naval-wise.
Crucial piece of real estate.
Hmm.
And then, of course, you've got the economics. Can't ignore that.
Yeah.
For a long time, Russia was Ukraine's biggest trading partner. Though that's weakened a lot recently, China actually surpassed Russia.
That's true.
But before 2014, Moscow really wanted to pull Ukraine into its own economic project, the Eurasian Economic Union. And the energy relationship was huge, too. For decades, Moscow relied on Ukrainian pipelines to get its gas to Europe, paying Kyiv billions in transit fees every year.
Hmm. And remarkably, that flow of Russian gas through Ukraine, despite everything, it actually continued into early 2023. Okay, at reduced volumes, but still.
Incredible, isn't it?
It really is. Which brings us to this question of, well, just sheer political sway. How much did Russia want to maintain influence? Moscow definitely wanted to keep its political clout, not just in Ukraine, but across the whole former Soviet space. And that took a big hit in 2004, remember? When its preferred candidate in Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, lost during the Orange Revolution.
Right, that was a big shock to the Kremlin.
Huge. And it followed a similar setback in Georgia in 2003, the Rose Revolution, and came before another in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, the Tulip Revolution. All these movements challenging Moscow's influence. Although Yanukovych did actually make a comeback later, becoming president in 2010.
Yeah, the political seesaw. So let's zero in on the specific triggers for 2014. Crimea, Donbass. It seems like Ukraine getting closer to the EU really brought things to a head, right? Late 2013, President Yanukovych, under huge pressure from Moscow, suddenly scraps plans for closer EU economic ties. And that decision, well, many Ukrainians saw it as betrayal by a corrupt government. It sparked massive protests across the country, Euromaidan, a movement pushing for Europe.
And Putin's framing of that upheaval, which eventually ousted Yanukovych, was quite specific. He called it a Western-backed fascist coup, claimed it endangered ethnic Russians in Crimea. Now, Western leaders largely dismissed that as, baseless propaganda.
Right.
But in response, Putin ordered that covert invasion of Crimea. Later, he publicly justified it as a rescue mission, saying, and this is a direct quote, "There is a limit to everything, and with Ukraine, our Western partners have crossed the line."
Wow. And then a very similar narrative gets rolled out to justify supporting separatists in southeastern Ukraine. Another area with lots of ethnic Russians, Russian speakers. Putin even started using that term Novorossiya, New Russia, harking back to imperial times.
Mm-hmm. And many sources indicate that armed Russian provocateurs, maybe agents from security services, played a really central role in stirring up those anti-Euromaidan movements into actual rebellion. But unlike Crimea, Russia officially denied direct involvement in the Donbas fighting for years, right up until the big invasion in 2022.
Right, the little green men denial.
Exactly. So fast forward to the full-scale invasion in 2022. Many Western analysts see this as, well, the culmination of years of Kremlin resentment. Resentment towards NATO's expansion after the Cold War into what Russia sees as its historic sphere of influence. Russian leaders, Putin included, have consistently argued that the U.S. and NATO broke promises made back in the early 90s. Pledges not to expand the alliance eastward. They saw it as humiliating, a direct threat.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. Like just before the 2008 NATO summit, Putin apparently warned U.S. diplomats directly, said Ukraine joining NATO would be a hostile act toward Russia. And then just months later, you have the Russia-Georgia war.
The timing is suggestive, certainly.
And even though Ukraine wasn't a full member, it did get much closer to NATO in the years before 2022. Annual military exercises that enhanced opportunity partner status in 2020.
Reserved for the closest non-member allies.
And Kyiv was pretty open about its goal, eventually getting full NATO membership.
So in the weeks right before the 2022 invasion, Russia laid out these major security demands to the U.S. and NATO. Things like stop NATO expansion altogether, get Russian consent for certain deployments, even remove U.S. nuclear weapons from Europe. Pretty sweeping demand.
Yeah, huge demands.
Alliance leaders said, look, we're open to diplomacy, but they were firm. We're not closing NATO's door to new members. As CFR's Thomas Graham put it back in February 2022, while in the United States we talk about a Ukraine crisis, from the Russian standpoint, this is a crisis in European security architecture.
Ah, okay.
And the fundamental issue they want to negotiate is the revision of European security architecture to something that is more favorable to Russian interests. So, a much bigger picture view from Moscow.
Interesting framing. But there's that powerful alternative perspective too, right? That maybe the biggest driver for Putin wasn't just NATO hardware, but his deep fear of Ukraine succeeding as a modern, Western-style democracy right on Russia's border.
Exactly. Many experts emphasize this point.
They argue that a successful democratic Ukraine would just inevitably undermine his own autocratic system at home, and it would shatter his hopes of rebuilding some kind of Russia-led sphere of influence.
Right. Like historian Ann Applebaum said quite concisely, Putin wants to destabilize Ukraine, frighten Ukraine. He wants Ukrainian democracy to fail. He wants the Ukrainian economy to collapse. He wants foreign investors to flee. It's about preventing a successful alternative model.
Making the alternative look bad.
Essentially, zooming out, Russia under Putin. Well, it's often described as a revanchist power. Basically, a nation trying to reclaim lost influence, lost prestige on the world stage. As Gerard Toll at Virginia Tech wrote, it was always Putin's goal to restore Russia to the status of a great power in northern Eurasia. The end goal was not to recreate the Soviet Union, but to make Russia great again. That kind of rhetoric.
Make Russia great again?
Mhm.
And didn't Putin write a long article in 2021 about this?
He did, yeah, explaining his views on their shared history, asserting Russians and Ukrainians are one people, occupying the same historical and spiritual space.
Setting the stage, perhaps.
Yeah.
Then throughout 2021, Russia builds up tens of thousands of troops near Ukraine's borders, later in Belarus too. And then, February 2022, he orders the full-scale invasion. About 200,000 troops coming from multiple directions, southeast, north, clearly trying to seize major cities, Kyiv included, and topple the government.
And his stated goals were broad to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Very loaded terms.
Man.
But in those crucial early weeks, the Ukrainian forces, they put up this incredibly stalwart resistance, really bogged down the Russian military in key areas. A lot of defense analysts pointed to Russian forces suffering from, well, low morale, serious logistical problems, and maybe an ill-conceived strategy that just assumed Ukraine would collapse quickly.
Which it obviously didn't. And then came that stunning setback for Russia in August 2022. Ukraine launches that major counteroffensive, recaptures thousands of square miles of territory, Kharkiv, Kherson.
Yeah, significant momentum shift. And Putin's response was pretty drastic. He ordered the mobilization of some 300,000 more troops, illegally annexed 4 more Ukrainian regions, on paper at least, and issued these really chilling threats about potentially using nuclear weapons to defend Russia's claimed territorial integrity.
Escalation upon escalation. The fighting then seemed to concentrate more along fronts in the Donbass, right?
Yeah.
But Russia also adopted this grim new tactic, deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure far from the front lines. Cities like Kiev hit repeatedly with missiles and drones.
Yeah, a brutal strategy aimed at breaking civilian morale and infrastructure. By the first anniversary of the full-scale war, the human cost was just devastating. Western officials estimated over 100,000 Ukrainian casualties killed or wounded. Russian losses likely even higher, possibly double that.
Just staggering numbers.
And the humanitarian crisis, immense. Around 8 million refugees fled Ukraine, millions more displaced inside the country. Looking ahead at that point, Ukraine's Western allies started pledging more sophisticated military aid, modern tanks, stuff like that, preparing for the next phases of fighting.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's look at the broader international response, and maybe crucially, what Ukrainians themselves want for their future. Right after the Soviet collapse, Washington's top priority regarding Ukraine was actually quite specific, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. Mainly focused on denuclearization.
Pushing Ukraine, also Belarus and Kazakhstan, to give up their nuclear arsenals. The idea was only Russia should keep the former Soviet weapons.
Right. And at the same time, the U.S. was also trying to bolster what seemed like a pretty shaky democracy inside Russia itself back then.
Interesting priorities in hindsight.
Well, some observers at the time were critical. They felt the U.S. maybe courted Russia too quickly, arguing it should have focused more on fostering, geopolitical pluralism elsewhere in the former Soviet space. Like Zbigniew Brzezinski, former U.S. National Security Advisor, wrote famously in Foreign Affairs back in early '94.
Ah, yes, the Brzezinski quote.
It cannot be stressed strongly enough that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. But with Ukraine suborned and then subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire. He saw Ukraine's independence as absolutely vital for geopolitical balance.
a critical check on Russian imperial ambitions. And just
Uh,
months after that article, you get the Budapest Memorandum in 1994,
mm.
where the US, UK, and Russia all pledged to respect Ukraine's independence and sovereignty, in return for Ukraine giving up those nukes and becoming non-nuclear.
A key agreement.
Fast forward 20 years, Russia seizes Crimea, and suddenly, restoring Ukraine's sovereignty becomes a top US and EU foreign policy goal again. Big shift.
Absolutely. And after the 2022 invasion, the U.S. and its NATO allies just dramatically ramped up support,
Mm-hmm.
defense, economic, humanitarian aid to Ukraine, while also hitting Russia with this unprecedented wave of
The
sanctions.
scale of the aid is huge, right?
Yeah.
By February 2023, the U.S. alone had committed over $50 billion.
Yeah, including really advanced military kit rocket systems, missile systems, helicopters, drones, even modern tanks eventually. And many NATO allies chipped in significantly too.
And the sanctions on Russia, they've expanded massively,
Yeah.
covering finance, energy, defense, tech sectors, targeting oligarchs, key individuals.
Some really potent measures, too, banning certain Russian banks from SWIFT, that global financial messaging system. That really hurts their ability to do international business.
Sets them off, basically.
Yeah. Plus, restricting Russia's access to its foreign currency reserves, blacklisting its central bank. And beyond governments, you saw tons of Western companies just pulling out or suspending operations in Russia.
And Russia was kicked out of the G8 back in 2014, right? Now the G7.
Correct. That suspension remains. The invasion also blew up Europe's energy landscape. Germany finally suspended approval for that controversial Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline in February 2022.
Right, it was a big deal.
And then in August 2022, Russia itself indefinitely shut down Nord Stream 1, the pipeline that used to supply maybe a third of Europe's gas. Huge economic ripple effects across the continent from that.
Definitely felt that one. So after all this,
Mm-hmm.
what about the Ukrainians themselves? What do they want? It's interesting, isn't it, how Russia's aggression seems to have actually boosted support for Ukraine moving westward?
It really has, paradoxically. Right after Euromaidan, they elected Petro Poroshenko, a businessman strongly favoring EU and NATO integration. Then, in 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky, the current president, beat Poroshenko, which seemed like a sign the public was fed up with the old political establishment, wanted real change.
A vote against the status quo.
Exactly. Now, polls before 2022, they showed somewhat mixed views on NATO and the EU. And remember, these polls excluded Crimea and the occupied Donbas regions. But even then, there was a clear trend. Over half supported joining the EU, and somewhere between 40 to 50% favored joining NATO. So a definite lean towards the West, even with nuances.
And that support seems to have solidified since the invasion. Just days after it started, Zelensky formally asked the EU for fast-track membership.
Right, and Ukraine officially became an EU candidate country in June 2022, a major symbolic step.
And then in September 2022, Zelensky formally applied for accelerated NATO membership too, pushing hard on both fronts.
He did. However, most Western analysts tend to agree that, much like the EU bid, full NATO membership, well, it doesn't seem likely in the immediate future, given the current war and the geopolitical complexities.
Yeah, seems like a tough ask right now. So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, our listener? We've really traced how Ukraine, this historical cornerstone, this cultural heartland, has become the absolute epicenter of this renewed great power conflict. For those deep tangled family ties with Russia to the complex geopolitical chess game, Ukraine's story is just fundamentally interwoven with Russia's identity, its global ambitions.
Mhm.
And critically, it impacts the entire security setup of Europe, the whole architecture.
Yeah, and putting it in that broader context, this whole deep dive really highlights that constant tension, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Between national sovereignty and these long-held historical claims, between a nation's desire to integrate westward and another power's drive for spheres of influence. It really forces us to ask, what kind of future can there be for a nation fighting so fiercely for its identity, stuck at this critical, often brutal geopolitical crossroads?
That's the huge question. So it may be something for you, our listener, to think about as you process all this. Given this incredibly complex web of history, the competing interests, the terrible human cost we've seen, how might the very definition of victory for any side involved here need to change or evolve if we're ever going to see a truly sustainable future for the region?